Welcome to Theology and the Arts Lunch, the Arts Lunch at United Theological Seminary. I'm Jennifer Freeman, and I'm the Associate Professor and Program Director of Theology and the Arts here. And I'm very excited to have with us the Reverend Dr. Cindi Beth Johnson, who will introduce herself in some work, but is currently our VP of Advancement. And also as the program director of the arts here at United, Theology and Arts at United for many years, and I'm excited to have her here and to share with us some of the long and storied history of the arts at United.
Thank you.
Hand it over
to
you.
Thank you to Jennifer for this lovely invitation. This is my favorite subject matter to talk about arts at United, and it's good to see people who I know. Derek's spouse, who is an alum, Jim, and Tyrone. Good to see you. And nice. I haven't met Stephanie and
This is Ben.
and Ben. Hi, Ben.
Right.
So Jennifer said I am the Vice President for Advancement, and that means I get to tell stories about what our students do, and that is exciting for me all the time. But I got to United after being in the parish for 7 years. And when I was in the parish, I would always say, what does Advent look like? Or what does Lent look like? Or how can we bring the magic of what happens in Vacation Bible School into the sanctuary on Sunday morning, so that there's this relevancy and excitement? And that led me to doing a DMin. I did it at what was the consortium then with Luther and United and other places. And someone said to me along the way, oh, you need to work with Wilson Yates. He is a professor. At that point, he was the dean at United Seminary. So I just drove over to United, and Wilson happened to be like on a call with Jane Dillenberger when I came by. And I said, I'd like to know if you'd be my leader for my thesis. And he said, yes. And he was pleased. So that's how my journey at United started. And it was very much related to the arts. Shortly after I started doing my DMin, United got a grant, and then they got another grant. And so there were ways in which my staying maintained. And then I also did other things along the way, like continuing education. But when I was thinking about Jennifer's lovely invitation, I was thinking that, United has had all these different seasons around the arts in terms of what has been the area of the most focus. And a lot of times that's been influenced by both the faculty and the students, and what the students are most interested in. And that's been a really fun thing to see, because it's been really organic. My hope has always been that even if you're not an artist, that you'll find a way to connect to the arts. Molly recently did a visit with a donor who was at an event, and she said, I don't do any art stuff. And by the time she was at this event, she took home knitting needles and yarn, and pretty soon she was coming to a knitting circle where we did spiritual reflection. And that if you are an artist, that you're going to pour your theology over it and see what happens, because I think amazing things happen when people pour theology over the arts. So just to kind of walk back and look at some of the earlier seasons, Eugene Jaberg was a founding member of the faculty, and he came from one of the predecessor seminaries from Mission House. And right at the very beginning, he established a summer religious drama program. And they had regular plays in the 60s and the 70s. He had the first interracial theater in the Twin Cities. And one of the actors who was part of it was Lou Bellamy, who then later went on to found the Penumbra Theater. And what they always did was they had intentional conversations after each of the plays, so that they could have conversations about the important religious and social issues that were raised. Gene also had a lot of background in film, and always was exploring theological questions about brokenness, redemption, and the role of the human community. Other faculty also brought contributions. Bob Bryant had a course of religion and literature, and Mary Bednarowski offered a lot of work in literature and poetry, and she integrated that into her courses. Clyde Steckel taught classes on music. And I think it would be fair to say that from the very beginning, the theological focus of United really Steve and Paul Tillich and also the Nevers really influenced the way people engage the arts as a primary expression of religion and culture, particularly Tillich, in looking at arts and how to think about that in terms of theological reflection. At some point, Wilson Yates came to United, I can't remember for sure what year, but at some point his work really moved from ethics, which I think he never really gave up, but to really around theology and the arts. And he really helped United move to sort of a national stage. People would say that he's a pioneer in this field. He's done really founding research. And in fact, we picked the name, the intersection for this space, in part because one of the things he did was write about the 6 intersections of theology and the arts, the prophetic, the liturgy, questions about the human condition, being prophetic, and then also always holding up what it is that we're supposed to move to. And I can give you all 6 of those in a better form than that. He received a Lilly grant, and they studied 134 seminaries and how the arts were being treated in 1987. So you see, that's really gone back. And the funding for that really came through the Carpenter Foundation, the Luce Foundation. At one point, the Luce Foundation came to United and the Minneapolis Institute of Arts and said, we want you to do a project entitled Arts and Religion in the Twin Cities. What are the intersections and how can we enrich those relationships? What a great opportunity that was. So as my role expanded, part of what we were able to do in that season was artists in residence. We had more exhibitions, lecture series. We had funding from Luce to do some national consultations where we would fly in scholars and artists. And we talked about arts and congregational renewal and the role of arts in interfaith dialogue, which were really interesting. Along with that, evolved a space for the arts. An old bookstore became, and Cheryl did a lot of work on this, the old Cokesbury bookstore became the art studio. And it wasn't as nice as this, but it worked, and it became a place where people would gather. The building of the chapel also really was influenced by our commitment to the arts. We would say that it was a theological statement about the immanence and transcendence of God in wood, glass, and stone. In and of itself, it really was a work of art. And we had an artist who liked to come to United. He would say, I want to have my art in your art. And what he meant by that was art was in the chapel. And what that afforded us was a place to also do music. And what I was excited about was that we were able to then have the art in the chapel space so we could have an exhibition and we can integrate it, which we can really do here too, right in that space. In time, Jan Weaver came, and she was really instrumental in developing the concentration in theology and the arts in the MA program. Well, actually, I think that had happened before. That happened with Kim Vredney. Kim Vredney had pushed for that. Then when Jan was here, it moved into the MDiv. And that was really early, having an arts concentration in 1992 in the MA, and then later on in the MDiv. Jan's work was very much in film and photography. She's a brilliant photographer. And she was instrumental in creating what Jennifer now teaches, the arts praxis, which invites a group of students. Prior to that, people did those as independent studies. And when people came together, it was very exciting because people were able to weave their work as theologians and practicing artists together in a context of other people. There's always been some opportunities to engage with institutions in the community, which is a challenge in this season where a lot of our students are not in the physical space, but being able to do things with the Weissman, the Gospel According to Jazz event. And we tried to really think about that we are in a really vibrant arts community, and that's part of what makes being here important. We also really tried to think about how to reflect diversity in what we were doing. And we would always wish for more, but some of the things that we did Cheryl and Roderick Selfo, who's now on our board, co-curated an exhibition on Hands Up, Don't Shoot Me, was what they had at Intermedia Arts. And we had the title of
Faith in action.
Faith in Action. So we tried to have an exhibit that talked about how churches are or are not really responding to these issues. And at Intermedia Arts, they were really pressing, why is it that women are the ones who are involved and doing all this work, but the focus often becomes on men. Hands Up, Don't Shoot. And we had some wonderful exhibits from the Somali community. We had a Katuba exhibit of illuminated Jewish marriage contracts, which was wonderful. We had an ATS visitor there, and it was a lecture, and he said, I've never given a lecture surrounded by tubas. It was really quite wonderful. And so really trying to reflect both diversity and engaging questions of justice. I think what is still happening, and what I hope happened then, is that we wish for the art around us, like I think of Stephanie's amazing art that was here for the praxis, that the art around us can influence what we take back to the classroom, and vice versa. One of the really significant exhibits we had was Deidre Shear, who's a fabric artist, and we brought two of her shows here. This was something that Patsy Herbert, who is no longer living, initiated. Patsy was taking a lot of chaplaincy classes, and she said, I think a lot of people who are in those chaplaincy classes have never been with a person who has died. She goes, how are they going to know how to be pastors or chaplains in that area or in that moment? So she arranged for us to bring these two shows, and they were just amazing shows. And one kind of looked at a person who was dying. I think it was a different image every month. And then the other one kind of reflected families and how families might be addressing this issue. And she would invite people to look at the different subjects and see ourselves in those different roles. And I think that was a really helpful way in which the questions that are right before chaplains would be something that they could see in the gallery. We also hope, and I think this continues, that people use the art as a way of nurturing or deepening their own spiritual practice. I find art making to be a spiritual practice. I do morning pages like Julia Cameron invites as a way of, I think, a spiritual practice. I think it also is an opportunity for us to build our empathy muscles. Like I can look at the images of a Somali artist and I can see something different than if I would walk past his family on the street. So I guess what I would say is at Luther, and I'm a graduate of Luther twice, they, at one point they're very Lutheran, right? And at one point they said, oh, we're an ecumenical seminary. And what that meant was they started getting the hymnals for the Methodists and the Episcopalians and Presbyterians. And they tried, but it wasn't like in their DNA. And what I wish for people, and what I wish for people to really know is that it's really in United's DNA from the very beginning, way before me. There was an exhibit of Granlund art that some student who I don't even know the name of did. And what I hope comes from that is that we don't know what society or the church is going to be like in 25 years. We have no idea. I mean, we might have thought we knew, but now since COVID, we have no idea. But what I hope students experience while they're here is that they'll really continue to practice and build their imagination, because in the end, the ability to be creative, I think, is one of the most important gifts of leaders. And also that we continue to use the arts as a lens for theological reflection. It's not decoration, it's not a plus thing, it's really core. And that we can learn things about questions that are very important by looking at how artists have depicted it visually or in a play or in a piece of music. So I thrilled when I found out that Jennifer was going to be in the Twin Cities at St. Thomas, working with Kim Friday, who's one of our alums, who is the person who pushed for the MA with an arts concentration. And Kim said, I think Jennifer might be around for a while. And so this wonderful unfolding of Jennifer getting here and being mentored by Robin Jensen, who came to many of our national consultations, is just this marvelous, another season in what the arts have been in life. So that would be my very quick
Yeah, it's a
history.
great, it's a great helpful.
Luckily, I wrote something about it a few years ago. Good notes. So anyway, and I'm just excited for the ways all of you bring new ideas. And I guess the other thing I would say that I found really important is that artists who were musicians started being interested in visual arts, and poets started doing photography. And so it isn't, sometimes it's about the deepening of your own artistic practice, but other times it's about the way other art forms will integrate into that and the interdisciplinary nature of it. So there you go.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
We'll share screen. And I could say more, but I also just wonder if there's any questions or comments, anything that anybody wants to add. We also have Cheryl, who is part of the
Yes.
arts program as volunteer, as staff, as student, now as alum.
You can't get rid of me.
Thank goodness.
Yeah, it's important to know that Cheryl was the gallery associate, and she installed those amazing shows that we had over there, and she did really complicated things sometimes. She is an artist herself, but also has the art of curating.
Mhm.
Is all art theological, Dr. Johnson?
I think that's a question Jennifer can answer. I think that there's art that is like I would call hotel art. It's too simple. It doesn't have theological rigor or artistic rigor. Like one of my favorite things is when I get invited to go to churches and they say, someone who doesn't want hotel art says, could you come and talk to people about the art we have in our church? And I think that no, the answer is no. Not all art is theological, but someone like Wilson has done tons of theological reflection on Francis Bacon. That wouldn't maybe be the first thing someone would pick off the shelf and say, what's the art in the grotesque? Has done some really important work on that. So I think more art is theological than we might think, but not all.
Why do you not want to talk about the art that's in the church?
Say that again.
You said you would say no to discussing the art that is around the church. And why is that?
No, I said that I'm not sure if I understand what you heard.
I think you were saying.
Maybe I
no.
misunderstood
You
something.
were saying no to Molly's question.
Oh, yeah.
As you were describing.
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm saying no, not all art is theological.
Got it.
you do often, but you do go to
I
churches.
do go to
and talk to-
churches, yeah. I think
We
churches
talk
have
about
a real
that.
challenge because they have art that, at Luther, someone crocheted the Lord's Prayer for us. And what did we do with that? We didn't know what to do with it. We finally, because I was on the arts committee over there, and finally, I'm sure it's long gone by now, because sometimes things get lost. I'm just saying. Things have gotten lost here sometimes. And in that case, what we ended up doing was we put this beautiful crocheted, it was beautiful, but it wasn't a good fit for what they were doing at that point. So we hung it inside the sacristy. So as people were robing, they had this present, but it wasn't a statement about how they thought arts reflect theology. So I think that's a challenge for churches. I'm all for heritage halls where you just put everything in one area that tells these stories from donors, but then in the spaces that are shared, and particularly I'm a big advocate for art in the sanctuary. It's art that has more theological depth or rigor.
And that somebody actually has to make a decision about what works there instead of just whatever somebody volunteered and offered. I know. Yeah, there could be a whole class on the management of arts in in the congregational life.
Absolutely.
I mean, because what a lovely thing to do to crochet. I mean, that's just,
I mean, it was beautiful.
don't want to shoot that
Bless
down.
their heart.
Yeah,
Bless their heart is the phrase.
but we had all sorts of other things, you know. And I think that's why it's really good to bring someone else in, you know, to say, you know, because then they can say, tell me about this, you know, what's the story?
Like a parent.
Yeah.
Sorry.
And then sometimes we find out, well, you know, that person isn't even a member anymore. It's really not helpful. It doesn't express what we want. I mean, you did the thing on the white Jesus and the stained glass. I've done that too. That's a huge problem theologically.
I'm curious to this theme. You said that at one point there were like, under some of that funding that you listed, and I don't know if were you directly involved in like you said, consultations with churches about art? Is this some of the work that you were doing is helping them with this?
So we had a consultation where we invited scholars and arts practitioners to reflect on that. And I have copies of the book that was written as a result of that, which I can bring in. But on my own, I've definitely gone to churches and worked with them on what they have or how to start an exhibition program. I actually think that there's a very large percentage of churches in the Twin Cities that have exhibition programs. And I don't know if that's been influenced by United, I don't know, but there are a lot of churches that have done that. And I think that's a really exciting thing. That's in my mind evangelism, as in we invite other stories inside.
And you mentioned there's programs for interfaith dialogue around the arts. I'm just wondering if you could speak. That sounds really interesting. to
So
me.
St. Thomas has that annual event, right?
I don't know, around interfaith.
Arts and interfaith.
They might, I didn't know about it.
I have a chapter in one of Eliezer's books on teaching. And I talk about how art can invite interfaith dialogue in a way that's different. And if I can find it, I'll find the chapter and send it to you. Because I think that's another really important. We have to have something outside of ourselves. You know, it's like being at a play, you know, we see this happening there, and then we can engage it differently than if someone says, you know, think about this or I think that's a really important piece of how we could.
You just given me a book idea. Baptismal scenes in Baptist churches. That may be the only place there's any art. And some of it's really bad in terms of Jesus at the Jordan. I mean, it's really bad. West Texas, they have cacti along the Jordan River.
It actually sounds.
Yeah, don't you think this would be a bestseller like The Good Shepherd?
I think we can.
Baptismal
I
art.
think we can endow the school on this one, don't we?
Yeah.
You know, Central Lutheran downtown, they just put in a new font. I love fonts. I'm not sure how much you know about Baptist fonts. But they put in a font that has 3 levels, which you would like.
For the
Big,
Trinity.
for the Trinity, and the water flows from one into the other. But then what I thought was super cool is they have tile on the floor, and like about as far as a splash would go, they put the same pattern that's in the font here, there on the floor. So there's that sense of, you know, both that we go out baptized or called, but also that, let's see, splashes.
Well, and I think the empathy piece too is that you were speaking to as part of the interreligious dialogue component. I think especially in like just literature and how important reading novels is for building empathy for just other humans. But in the visual arts too, I think the unique thing about literature is getting the point of view of the narrator, or there's something that's distinct about literature. What do you think, Cheryl?
what do I think?
Uh-huh.
I liked one of the articles that Wilson Yates did on the dialogical approach to art, and sort of comes back to your question, is all art theological? And there's the artist, one part of the conversation, the art is another player, and then the viewer. And the more you know about the artist, then maybe you know more about what went into the art that was created. But the important conversation I think that we think about is the one between the art itself and the viewer. And even hotel art can possibly speak to someone wherever they are in their particular journey that points them to the divine, that speaks to them in some way, and to be cognizant of that conversation in when you're creating your own art, if you're a visual artist, or if you're writing music, lyrics or poetry, who's reading it and reading it from their own particularity. Wilson brought out some really good points in that, and brought up an aspect to my own that I didn't think about. And I brought it into curating exhibitions and where you place particular pieces in conversation with what's around them. Where do they see it? From what point? From what vantage point? It isn't always just a nice room that's a gallery that where you just sort of hang it. We live in conversation with everything else around us, and so does art. So my opinion is that yes, all art is theological. However,
But some is bad theology.
but even that has merit.
Yeah, I guess, it maybe has merit, but would maybe be something I would. In this context. The dialogical approach is a very important piece. I mean, that I think is.
Tyrone.
So much to that last point. I guess one of the things I've noticed in religious spaces, churches that have displays of art or exhibitions, is that there is often, and by the way, Philadelphia Cathedral is one such space where I'm at now. There is often conversation about the artist's work and often the artist's life, but not so much conversation around the theological lens that we can kind of peer through. And so I'm curious, what kinds of questions do you think would actually tease out that more theological underpinning of the art? And does anything come to mind, or does any sets of questions come to mind in terms of how you really kind of tease out the theological interpretation of the art?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And of course, it can vary quite a bit by the types of work that you're showing, right? Like some are more theological in terms of their iconography, obviously in their iconography. And I talk, I think that, I guess I've often posed it to students that there are several ways that the arts are theological. So there's the very basic one in subject matter, which is the most obvious, but then the arts can be theological in their context. Kind of what the little debate here was also about, is where things appear also affects our interpretation maybe. So context and function, maybe how they're treated and used in space. So here on campus, if we have a painting in the president's office and then we move it into the chapel, that, and because of the context, invites a different response or interpretation, even kind of subtly. I think the arts can be theological in the medium, like, so the material that's used can convey theological meaning. Again, so context is always the key, but it can vary a bit. But you know, this Thursday, we're celebrating the opening of the Leadership Center, and Cheryl has facilitated bringing these looms into campus, and so we're going to be doing a community weaving exercise basically as part of the event, which has deep theological meaning. We can bring that lens to it in terms of the medium and the method of making these woven, you know, tapestries. The thing that I always start with when I invite students to talk about art is just, what do you see? You know, what are we, I mean, this is visual art, so, but we could apply it to other, you know, media as well. And just starting with description. One, if you have folks in your community, you know, often not everyone is comfortable in talking about art. They feel like it's a specialist thing, or, you know, an exclusive thing. I know those timed out lights. I'm always waving my arms in my office. Usually for good reason, sometimes. But you know, that I find that like an inclusive way to start a conversation about art, because you can't get wrong what you see. It's your impression of what's happening in an image or in a sculpture or whatever. And then you can kind of, you know, if you have more information about the artist or whatever, you can fold some of that in. And so you usually try to lead students through, let's start with just a description, you know, and so you try to avoid, like they might say, well, that's Mary in the center, right? And you said, well, let's just start with saying it's a woman who's dressed in a blue cloth and she has it, you know, so we're just not interpreting or ascribing meaning, but just start with description. Because then you tend to, you don't do that thing of jumping to assumptions. And so you can start with description, then move towards interpretation, using those descriptions to ground your interpretation, right? So because that woman's wearing blue and she's in the center of the image, I think she might be Mary, you know, like, then you can kind of like do that. Anyway, all of that is to just say, if it's not explicitly religious in its iconography, I would start to think about like themes that you might see. So if there's a depiction of, you know, loss or community, or something that might invite a conversation about just like, what's personhood? You know, these kinds of like really big questions. And that's to Cindi Beth's point about, for example, Wilson's interpretation of Francis Bacon, or taking contemporary art that is not on its face theological, and maybe the artist didn't intend a theological interpretation, but we as viewers can bring that lens and apply it to our context. I'm probably giving much longer of an answer than you wanted, but that's my initial response.
Great, thank you, yeah.
Well, that art doesn't have to have religious subject matter to invite a religious experience.
Mhm.
I think that's.
Yeah, and Tyrone, I know because you're in this new role, you know, in your community, and you're, you know, working with the arts, and what's your, I know you're still new, so maybe you're still kind of thinking about this and getting oriented, but what's your experience been so far, or what are you encountering?
Yeah, I think that there is, I think my observation is that there has been a lot of, embrace of the visual arts in particular here at the cathedral for the past several years. But there hasn't really been, I don't think, a really intentional conversation about the theological underpinnings. And I think that is the missing link, I think, which doesn't really do justice to the art, doesn't really do justice to the artist, and doesn't really do justice to the idea of art within religious spaces, right? I mean, the whole point, I think, is to actually think about how those components intersect. And if there's not that, if there's not that dimension of deep conversation, reflection, interpretation, then I think it's not adequate. It's just art on the wall, right? It's just art on the wall
Yeah.
at that point, right? And I think that so I think that's one of the challenges, I think, and yet one of the opportunities for kind of me and my role here, which I'm kind of looking to kind of, you know, work through, understand that better, and
Yeah.
That was just the word that popped into my head. It just seems like a lost opportunity, you know, if people are creating work or choosing work that does have some kind of theological import, that should be an opportunity for conversation and for spiritual practice and for those at the cathedral. So
right,
how
right.
cool.
Mhm.
Yeah, I mean, I think thinking of it as an opportunity is good, because there are so many ways that you could squeeze a lot of juicy
Mhm.
meaning out of that, whether it's that's how you do it.
Right.
Digestion.
Right,
But
exactly. Mhm.
yeah, through programming, or and even as simple as like if there's adult ed and kind of walking through together as a group, or with the children's ed program too, kids tend to be more comfortable in talking about art than adults sometimes, and so can be a
Right.
good model for grown-ups to follow children.
Right. But it does, I think it does require a kind of a stretching of artists themselves. And in this particular context, it requires a stretching of artists who also claim to be people of faith, right? And so I mean, the stretch is that they would have to kind of talk about, perhaps their own faith experience, their own faith journey, I think, which would help, I think, broaden the scope. So
Yeah.
Um, so it's great.
Yeah.
Good to be here.
I mean, I'm excited to hear how things develop as you kind of continue to step into your role there.
Yeah, we'll see what happens. I mean, and I'm not what we call canons here at the cathedral. I'm not the canon for the arts. We have a canon for music and the arts. I'm really the canon for congregational life, who happens to have an art background and who happens to be in a DMN program for arts and theology, right? So, which I suspect is one of the reasons they probably was probably brought on board anyway. But yeah, so.
Well, thinking of the music, like, it seems like this is my impression, you all could tell me, but that in some ways, that music, we take music for granted a lot, I think, in worship contexts, and so it's like as though it's like self-evident. And so I think that there's less, it's interesting that I think visual art, can always use more attention and intentionality, but my instinct is that, or my impression is that even the visual arts get sometimes more, that there's a talk or something like that, and we're singing, every week, and not really talking about, depending on if you don't have, some places have a really strong music program, and so maybe there are kind of lessons on the music that's being sung. But I think for the most part, that's an art form that doesn't get really kind of like theologically unpacked, maybe in the way that it could.
Unless the organist is really bad.
Maybe in a negative sense, right? If there's critiquing the organist or something like that, yeah. There's maybe some talk then, but I just.
Center Iowa, that's where I was on Sunday.
Oh, okay. Oh, my.
But I think you're right, the same questions that you can ask of a piece of art, you can ask of music, you can ask of a play or a poem.
A lot of opportunities. Well, I want to be mindful of our time. What's the next class? arts in a little bit, but are there any other comments or questions or reflections?
Jennifer, what's the current season of the arts at United?
The current season.
I saw that.
Yeah, that's a hard wrap up question, or maybe it's a good wrap up question. What is the season? Well, we are in a season of opportunities. That's gonna be my new word. It's a season of opportunity.
Isn't that just used as a synonym for challenge?
Yes. Exactly, exactly. Well, I think we're, we hit both in United as an institution, the Twin Cities art scene nationally and so on, of course, because of the pandemic, arts funding is hit widely, the livelihood of artists. I mean, there's a lot of like negative impacts that we could talk about, and the state of theological education and a lot of reasons that we might kind of rend our garments. But I think that United's program in the arts contributes to our continued increased student enrollment. And I hear that from students who are not in the arts concentration, that part of the reason they come to United is because we have an arts concentration and because the arts are embedded in the curriculum and so on. And so that to me is really encouraging and confirms what I already believe about the arts, which is that they are necessary. It's not an opt-in kind of situation, I would say. And I state this strongly when I'm talking to colleagues who teach church history, for example, which is that if you're not incorporating the arts into your presentation of the Christian past, then you're not, you're missing out on most of the theological meaning making that occurred in church history. That doesn't mean that everyone has to be art historians, but they need to at least be aware of that and kind of hold a little space off to the side to say, here's content that we're not accessing because we're not talking about the arts. And you could say I would make theological reasons for the arts too, from a Christian standpoint. It would be the incarnation, but I won't get into the Byzantine iconoclastic controversy now. But I would say that I think they're urgent, that the arts are urgent, and I think that that's affirmed in, for example, we see in like community protest-based art that springs up, for example, in the aftermath of the murder of George Floyd. And that what's the response? Murals, impromptu shrines, like these kinds of artistic installations, basically, that sprung up all over our country. And I think that that's, evidence of the power of the arts, and that this is the way that we as humans like commemorate and mourn and cry out, and not just negative things, but then also build new worlds, right? And so it's part of that envisioning of new worlds that is really powerful. And I see our students doing that in every single class that I teach. So we have exciting things like Gabriela Boros's work that's in the gallery right now, and she'll be speaking at the upcoming symposium week. And she'll be in dialogue with myself and Dr. Munjid Murad. And so we'll have speaking of interreligious conversations around the arts. And so we'll be talking about her beautiful pieces. Yeah. And next week, actually, we can end with another plug. So we've got this week the opening of the Leadership Center with the Weaving Project. Then next week on Wednesday, as part of the 60th anniversary kickoff, Wilson Yates and I will be having a conversation about our perspectives on art and theology, past and present. So it'll be fun. Okay, well, I think we should wrap things up. Next week, we're going to do still life drawing. And flex some drawing lessons. I'll see you there, Cheryl.
Oh, memories of the orange stuck to the wine bottle. So I didn't know perspective.
You can do a collage still life. I'll encourage drawing, but I hope you'll come. And then the week after that, I believe we've got Isabel Nelson scheduled, October 4th. She'll be reading and talking about her poems that she wrote for the Arts Practicum in the spring. So highly recommend their delightful, earthy, guttural kind of reflections on motherhood and the earth and all kinds of things. So it's kind of like Little Red Riding Hood meets werewolves meets, I don't know what, something good. It smells like moss. The poems. Okay, thanks everyone, and thanks to
Oh,
Cindy
thank
Beth
you.
for taking the time.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Mhm.